Welcome to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. The podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bit in between.
Welcome to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. The podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bit in between. With your host, Barry Kirby.
And welcome to this new episode of 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. They do say that podcasts are like buses, that you wait for ages for one and then multiple of them come along at the same time. This podcast is coming out a bit quicker than we usually would do because this is a really, really topical subject and I really want to get it out so everybody knows about it. We're going to be talking about sensory design, and these are specifically linked to some workshops as well. So I want to bring in my guest, who is Alastair Somerville. Alastair, welcome.
Thank you, Barry. Hi.
Now, bit of a confession. Ali's somebody that I've been wanting to interview for quite a long time, ever since we met actually at a home education event many years ago in Gloucestershire, and we sat chatting to each other, and suddenly we realised that we both kind of do the same thing. We just call it different things. Alice is very much more on the UX side of life, where I'm on the human factors side of life, but. If you look at your job title on LinkedIn, you call yourself a sensory design consultant. I was wondering if you could just give us a bit of an insight into what a sensory design consultant is.
Sure. A sensory design consultant is really trying to talk about how we're designing multimodally, not getting trapped by the idea of we're designing for vision alone, but also not getting trapped by the idea that we're designing for a single sense, talking about how do we design across the human perception, and also how do we design through the depth of human cognition. So it's an idea that we need to sort of move into whichever is the best mixture of senses for achieving the purpose that the user has.
So surely that's quite simple then, because historically we've got sort of 5 senses. Is it not that simple?
It's not that simple in terms of, I mean, currently I work on about, practically speaking, about 9 senses is about where I am at the moment. But the other issue is really quite how much the change in ideas around embodied cognition have changed the way in which we think about how are human beings processing the information, and also the ideas coming out of sort of the more visceral research about how much the cognition isn't in the brain, but it's actually spread through the body, through the interoception systems inside of ourselves. And this shifts some of the ways in which we talk and some of the ways in which we work, because it's not merely just about the senses of the person. It's the person, their body, in the place, in that time, with those people. And that's much broader than just saying it's just the sensory sort of delimit of the touch, the feel, the smell, the sight, the hearing.
This is going to give us a real insight in a few moments. So we will dive more into this in a couple of minutes, because it sounds absolutely fascinating. But obviously, how did you get into that? How have you got into this sensory design? What's been your sort of career path?
My career path is extraordinarily messy, but in terms of how I got to here, in about 2008 or so, I started up a 3-dimensional scanning and printing business for museums, for cultural organisations, where we were replicating objects in 3D. But what became clear was actually it wasn't the making of the object, the 3-dimensional replication, which was of interest. It was the manipulation of the data files and the data sets into different formats to provide information in different ways. And particularly my specialization is tactile maps and tactile design for blind people, and the ways in which we could manipulate texture and form in 3D for providing information in ways which was useful to blind people, even though the objects were visually completely and radically different from what they would look like for people with vision, or what the original object was. So a lot of that drew into the idea that it wasn't about the senses, it was about the perception. And that drew me sideways into sensory design, in the sense that the issues of the design for different forms of sensory capacity and the different forms of, particularly nowadays, cognitive capacity, means that you have to talk about all the senses, all the perception. And that's how I came to where I am now.
Wow. So it's really been a journey of evolution in many ways, to bring you to this point.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing leads to another. One problem set leads to another research set, which leads to another problem set, which never leads to another research set.
So you run your own consultancy, of which I will make sure all the links, firstly to your LinkedIn and to the to the company website in the program description. But how does a client know that they need to engage you and engage it in I guess in this breadth?
A majority of my clients, the majority of people I come across, come via the more sort of commonly known area of accessibility. So a lot of people come to me via accessibility work, or the title.
Yeah.
However, the reason I don't talk about accessibility is accessibility has an awful habit of othering people. It becomes, this is about this person with this impaired type of sense. They are not like me in terms of, and sensory design is sort of much more trying to sort of flip that around, in the sense that we all have senses. They work slightly differently. Our perception uses them slightly differently, but we all have senses. So I try to sort of move away from the negative concepts that sometimes accessibility has. But that's where it comes in. I also draw in a number of clients via the fact that particularly in the workshop work, that I'm well known for sort of getting workshops which people enjoy, and from a lot of work nowadays comes out of VR, where a lot of the discussions are about how does embodiment and perception work.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, that's one of the reasons that we want to talk to you for quite a while, and we will go into it in the next section around the delivery of workshops, because I was quite privileged to attend just one of the presentations you gave quite a while ago, talking about sensory and perception and things, and it was one of these things that sometimes you can go to certain workshop presentations and maybe doze off, be checking your phone and that type of thing, but the way that you engage is really quite something else, and it makes it interesting and engaging. So yeah, no, I think that's really cool. So obviously we've had this small thing called the pandemic for the past 18 months or so. How have you been coping with that? How have you got on? Either have you learned anything about yourself through this period?
In terms of sort of yes, it's led to quite radical changes in terms of sort of the inability to go out and do work with people, but it's also led to a lot of sort of reconsideration of the way in which the work that I do can be reformatted or reused in different ways. So, particularly the very first sort of quarter, the 3 months after it things started, was extremely quiet for me, and in many ways that was deliberate, because I was just trying to work out how does one change from the idea of doing a lot of work which is very much about the physicality of work and design, and also workshops which are very much about the visceral communal experience, to being on Zoom or being on whichever format. So so a lot of that led to changes which have been implemented sort of since then. So my style of presentation and the way in which I think about work has changed quite a lot.
Have you been able to reflect anything on about your own abilities or your own capability in this respect? I mean, I know that I've been trying to lead teams almost, like I say, from my own desk, my own front room, and it's certainly had to bring in for me a whole lot of different skills of leadership and engagement that I hadn't really thought of before. Has there been anything like that for you, or is it have you been able to just drive forward?
I don't manage people directly, so therefore I don't have those issues. I think I've changed a lot in terms of the way in which I talk about psychological safety and the way in which I talk about how do we talk about things much more explicitly, in a sense that Zoom and at a distance means that there's certain subtleties are being lost, which need to be not just left alone in terms of just letting them drift, but actually making some certain specific things to do with how do we talk and relate to each other much more explicit, to be able to make sure that things are being covered.
Yeah, no, that's been one of the major. I mean, I think that some of the things that we've been missing is just the ability to have a chat. Meetings for me were engagement in that respect. You might have a formal meeting, but before and afterwards, you'd have a brew and engage with the people that you're talking with beforehand, the small talk and that type of thing. And we just don't seem to have that anymore, unless you actually build it in. And it's I think it's been really interesting. The dynamic about how we use this remote stuff has been really interesting. Right, we're going to have a very quick break, and then we're going to come back into looking at the sensory design in more detail. So don't go away.
You are listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. We wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you for your support. You can help further by rating us through your podcast provider, sharing us through social media, and telling your friends and colleagues. Let's work together in raising awareness of the value in putting users at the center of what we do.
Cool. So we started talking about sensory design, and how do you embed sensory design almost as is it a process thing? Do you have a sort of a process or a set of rails that you use to engage it, or are you brought in as as a part of somebody else's process?
I'm generally brought in to assist or to provide quite small amounts of guidance in terms of nudging people through their projects or nudging their people through their product service development to help them understand some quite specific issues. Where I normally turn up in projects is what I prefer is to turn up early, so as to stop people from going down routes which will lead to errors much later in their development. However, in a lot of projects, I do turn up quite late in their projects in terms of trying to mitigate or adjust something that's gone terribly wrong already. Okay. So in terms of process, preferable process for me is to come in early and actually engage with sort of users or possible users of the product service in order to be able to understand their, and I think this is where I differ from a number of people, in order to understand capacities rather than impairments. And it's being able to spot what's the capacity of a person and how they're using their capacity differently due to physical or cognitive impairment that matters to me, so that then we can guide the project into aligning with the capacities of the humans that they're actually interacting with. A lot of design has a habit of designing for the impairment, not the person.
That's really interesting. So I guess that means that you've got to understand such a breadth of people as well, because whilst not everybody has exactly the same impairment, that also must mean that not everybody's got the same ability either. So how do you bring all that together?
In terms of the work, I mean, I have to say, and this is probably where I do different from human factors in some senses, is I'm probably more qualitative in terms of my approach to things. I mean, I do know quant data in terms of inclusive design guidelines and all the rest of it. However, I'm more interested in both talking to people and observing people's interactions and conversations about their use of their capacities, because these are the ways in which we can talk about how we create the adjustability of the product or service. We look to see what boundaries that we can think about in the design. Because this comes out of a lot of the way in which my work between wayfinding and cognition sort of swap over. Having some form of boundary in the design, some form of constraint is necessary in order to be able to get anywhere in the design. But it's making sure the boundaries and the constraints aren't actually placing some people over the other side. And that particularly one of my things I loathe is the idea that there are users who are non-standard or not normal. The idea of normal is extraordinarily problematic to me in terms of the idea of the edge user. The edge user is an awful concept because it basically is saying that from our perspective, and it means that you as designers are choosing a specific perspective about what normal is, and that's never a good idea. So my approach is understanding capacity, understanding the people, and then very slowly approaching the technology or the service in order that we're not actually focusing on trying to fit people to the products or service, but actually fit the products or service to the people. So you start with the humans.
Yeah, the way that you describe that is really interesting because, as you say, I mean, human factors in itself is, human-centered design is supposed to be very, very human-focused, but I do know, say in the defence world that I work in, that if you're looking at the anthropometrics or whatever of people, you have the full range of people, and you take the big wedge in the middle, and so there are going to people drop off at either end, and I'm as guilty of that as the next person, I think. And I think to have the way that you phrase that actually puts that into a very different context. But I like the way that you describe normal as well. I think if somebody ever describes me as normal, I sort of take that as a bit of an insult. I think normal's a bit boring. But the other thing that you mentioned there was about wayfinding. That might not be a term that most people are generally used to. So could you describe a bit about what wayfinding is, please?
Yes. So wayfinding is helping people get from where they are to where they want to be. And in many ways, people think it's making maps is generally viewed as that's wayfinding, but it's much broader than that in the sense that it's about talking about the totality of a system of guidance, which may include maps, but also includes signs, training of people, technologies, all of these things, the way in which the mobile technologies interact, and all of these things are all to do with wayfinding. But one of the things which also is important when talking about wayfinding in the way that the neuroscience of wayfinding, which is something I watch deeply, is that a lot of the way in which we guide ourselves through physical environments is true of how we guide our way through digital environments. And the way in which we also guide ourselves through learning. The way in which we learn, the way in which we understand things is also based upon cognitive maps, based upon cognitive wayfinding. So all of these things sort of crisscross over each other, and at the heart of it is wayfinding theory. Okay.
So can you give us a practical example about where you've supported a project through wayfinding?
Sure. So, I mean, we create a lot of maps for different heritage organisations. We're just coming out of a project in York, which will be installing sometime in the next few months, for one of the medieval castle in York. Okay. And particularly the work we've been doing is we were brought in mostly just to do the tactile design work for a map, which was going to be installed outside of the castle, the keep. But we've extended it because one of the things I've been changing and trying to get clients to understand is that just having one big map on site at the entrance is not helpful wayfinding, and that they need to be able to present the information in depth across the totality of the user's journey. So we've also created little tactile maps which can be postcard size that can be sent to people before they come, which are highly simplified but are giving a sort of sense of orientation before arrival. So a lot of this comes down to the idea that cognitive maps need to be set up with boundaries, and then you provide more and more detail which infills into it. So sort of neuroscience of sort of the way in which cognition works. So we've built things that are possible to use beforehand, the map which is on site, and then much more detailed maps of the interior for very specific parts. And then over all of that, there's also QR links to audio guides, which then provide detail. So it's a way in which we talk about how do you create a sense of the total journey rather than just a single map, and how do you balance the cognitive load and create a cognitive journey for a person so that they can begin to understand whether the thing is relevant to them, begin to have a sort of baseline map of the area, and then you add detail aligned with their desire to have the detail. Because, of course, a lot of this comes down to you need to align the emotional requests, the emotional demands of the person with the actual information provision. And this comes to, and as you said at the beginning, a lot of, we met because of home education. A lot of my theories come out of a lot of the work in self-directed learning, which home education uses. And this is the, how do we actually provide information from our side as designers or as organizations, but align it with the individual's cognition and emotional interests.
So that's got to be really intensive, because that knowledge generation piece where you've got to understand what the user's journey is going to be and how to support it. That's going to be substantial, but also be really interesting as well, because everybody's, as we said with the with sensory side of things, everybody's wants and needs are going to be slightly different. But that's going to be quite good fun to do.
Yes, I mean it's also, and I think it changed quite heavily for me in probably about 5 years ago, when I was doing some work in London for the Imperial War Museum, and it became very clear that the way in which they designed the new exhibit, and also what information they were requesting from us for the mapping, they were ignoring that actually there was quite a serious problem with design for autistic people, in a sense that the environment they were creating was, in sensory terms, quite difficult. And that sort of area of how do we actually talk about, and this was stretched also with some work in dementia, how do we talk about anticipation and anxiety? Those sort of the loop between how do we, and human beings are very much sort of leaning into the future. Yeah. How do we actually help people have positive anticipation and minimize their anxiety about what happens next? Where do I, the next step, the next moment is really important nowadays. And that actually comes up quite a lot in the virtual reality work and other parts of work, where how do we actually, I've had many conversations about this sort of anxiety, i.e. why people don't go to a place, why people don't take the next step. Okay. Because that's actually the thing which we need to design around. How do we actually enable people to go out? Loneliness work, we came across a lot of people don't go out because of a specific anxiety issues. And that sort of, those areas are really interesting.
I was going to say, I mean, just before we go on to the next bit, I've always had this idea about when you go to meetings, businesses, or whatever, that actually one of the hardest things to do is to actually walk in the front door, because it doesn't look either appealing, inviting, or even accessible. There's certain meetings, community meetings, for example, if you hold them in a certain place, they just don't look. When I've talked to people about why they didn't come to the meeting, they're like, well, the door just wasn't open. And I guess that leads into in a very small way into what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the books which I read while trying to reconsider how to design workshops and things last year was The Art of Gathering, which is a very good book on talking about how do we talk better about how we invite people to meet us or to talk with us. And a lot of that is about this idea of, we have, particularly certain sort of organizations and certain groups have a very specific way in which we present ourselves to other people, which actually we think is being polite and professional and showing, good etiquette. But actually every single one of those things is actually a barrier to somebody else coming in and actually meeting us. So, rather like the edge user discussion and normal, the way in which we talk and the way in which we design is actually building the walls to ensure that the diversity and inclusion doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's really cool. Now I'll put a link to that book on the description as well. So you've mentioned the workshops and things now. That is that, as you said, that's a huge chunk of your work. Could you give us a bit of an overview about what sort of workshops you run and what you do?
Yeah, so workshop-wise, in order to be able to do anything with the sensory design work, I have to run workshops inherent in the work, in the sense that we need to work with people with differing cognition and physical impairments to be able to understand the problem space. However, I also found it useful to provide the workshops to professionals, i.e. people within government or within the UX service design industries in particular, in terms of helping them understand their own sensory capacities in order that they have a much more broad idea of how to interact with people with differing capacities. This is at a fundamental level, is if I can get you to understand the diversity and divergence of your own personal sensory and perception capacities, you are more likely to be open to the differences in other people's sensory and perception capacities. So sensory UX workshops came out of that, and those workshops were very successful in terms of developing particularly work in large international conferences. And all of them are designed around having very particularly, I am very much a person who facilitates quite visceral sort of physical experiences, because I can't get people to understand embodiment and the design for perception without making them use embodiment and visceral experiences. You can't do it by PowerPoint. Yeah. You have to actually put people in situations, put people with physical objects and communal experiences to order to understand the thing that we're talking about. Which of course means that facilitation wise, I have to and have adjusted my techniques quite heavily, because I have to be making sure that people aren't being distressed by the workshops. There's a lot of issues to do with psychological safety which come up in this stuff, which I've learned, and that's one of the reasons I watch and read quite a lot of the stuff on these issues. But over time, having done sort of sensory UX, I then moved through. I use the workshops mostly to follow my research interests, because I work on the basis that I create workshops which are useful for people to understand a problem. So when talking about augmented reality and virtual reality and information architecture, it was much easier to actually create workshops for information architects so that we can actually try and understand it better together. So I so a lot of the subjects I've dealt with in workshops, and I do a lot of workshops on a lot of radically different issues. You know, I've done transcendental design, I've done hope as a concept. All of these things is not because I'm specifically an expert in these things, but I am capable of creating a bounded space in terms of a workshop with a certain amount of information, and then working with people and using the intelligence of the room and using the intelligence of the people to create new experiences and new ideas.
So I've seen pictures of some of the workshops you run where you do, you blindfold people, you give people objects and things like that. How do you find people are receptive to that type of thing? Is it a case of the people who come to your workshops know what to expect, or do you, as you said before about looking after their psychological well-being, how do you do that to begin with?
I think I'm relatively clear, and I think going back to the art of gathering thing, I think I am much more explicit and much clearer about what's going to happen than I was about 6 or 7 years ago, in terms of I want people to understand what they're about to go through. However, I do still leave a certain amount of gaps in the way in which I talk to people, because there's certain amount sometimes I find people will avoid going into a workshop because they think it's not relevant to them. I've found that when, I've worked with Google and people where you find that certain groups of software developers or people who work in hard data don't want to go near stuff which seems like soft information. However, so therefore, I have to vaguely manipulate how much I tell people in order to make sure I don't scare certain groups of people off,
right?
Who would benefit from the knowledge, but they avoid certain things because they think it's too difficult or too messy or whichever.
Yeah. So obviously you've got this is quite a significant part of the work you do, because you've been literally all around the world doing this now. How did you start this? This is almost as that arm of your business, your arm of your capability? Was it accidental, or was it a plan, or?
Oh, no, it was pretty accidental. Most of my career is. I think where it was about, must be 2016. I happened to notice there was a local event, well, local to me, UX Bristol had an open invite out for 1 hour workshops, and I'd never actually run a workshop up to, well, in terms of a sort of education workshop before then. However, I was just interested in and this was at sort of possibly the peak of the sort of wearables, they're coming, what are they going to do kind of thing. And I was just interested in sort of trying to present a workshop which was trying to say wearables aren't just about screens on wrists. We need to talk about something more than that, and we need to talk about multimodal. So I designed a very small workshop which was basically just to scare the crap out of people in a sensory terms of just trying to make sure that they understood that vision alone wasn't the way in which we take information in, and this is UX, which is for the most part user experience is web design, as was. And so I did that workshop, and it went very well, and then it was known to other conferences in the UK, picked up on it, and then they sort of offered. I mean, this is getting into this. You're working for travel expenses only. But it, and so I did a few workshops which were travel expense only, and got that. And then because of the way in which conference organizers watch each other's conference agendas, it was clear that my name and sort of things were being picked up. So then I started doing American conferences, then Australia, and then so forth, and then sort of through Europe and all the rest of it. So, and then as you're more known, then the ability to actually charge the workshop at a sort of, commercial rate. Stuff comes up, and then that leads to work with private stroke sort of government work.
Yeah.
So that's how it really went. But it starts small in doing 1 hour for a small local people,
So that's really inspiring. You just basically had a thought, an idea, and just basically ran with it to see what happened, and then it's evolved and developed and you've refined it as you've gone.
Yeah, and that's why I've got of the things I do. I've done workshops for people to be able to write their own talks and create their own workshops, because it is about just having the confidence to take the first step.
Yeah.
And I've hopefully doing a conference workshop for free on, I think, 24th September for designing your own workshop, well, hybrid workshop, because I fell into this sort of by accident, by just trying it, and other people should try it too. The more voices, the more ideas, the more experiences we hear, it's better for all of us.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, fundamentally, that's why I started this podcast, was because I just wanted to give it a go and see whether we could do something. Obviously, now with COVID, workshops are not what they used to be. How have you evolved and developed during COVID, and what do your workshops look like now?
Yeah, I took about 3 months off in terms of trying to even vaguely work out what the hell I could do when COVID happened, because all of my facilitation skill and all of my design skill is based around designing quite visceral, emotional, physical experiences for 3 hours or more, where we have a community of people together working on problems. Mm-hmm. And therefore almost everything about the way in which Zoom and all of these other things were presented was utterly flat and utterly unusable as far as I was concerned for my purposes, let alone sort of, from a psychological safety area, that I was deeply worried very early on that sitting in front of a screen and a camera for hours and hours and hours, watching PowerPoint or watching a talking head was not going to be good for the way in which people could learn or the way in which people could interact. So I ran a series of workshops last year, probably in about, I think it must have been June, on dissent and theories of dissent in terms of how to, rather than looking at resilience, I look at rebellion in terms of organizations, and the dissent workshops were based around that. But they were mostly me testing how to think about how to design workshops and design assets around the workshops which would work in ways which would minimize stress and maximize learning. And it was, how do we talk about asynchronous and synchronous time? How do we talk about the purely digital Zoom encounter meeting, but also other ways of interacting with people? And how do we change the information load? And again, it comes back to wayfinding. How do we actually spread the creation of a cognitive map over time and over the capacity of the person's, ability to learn and ability to have time to learn.
How did you find delivering them workshops last year? And I sort of come at it from a slightly selfish perspective. I did give a webinar on usability, UX, and that type of thing as part of a Wales-centric event. And in some ways, because the facilitation wasn't there for people to be able to chat and engage and all that sort of stuff, I found it really difficult, because you were just talking to a screen. It wasn't till that point I truly realised how much I really needed the energy from the people you present to, or even just them subliminal cues of people nodding, people shaking their head, people scratching their nose, to work out how connected people were. How did you find doing that? And did you find it difficult, or did you find it easy? Or
I think it depends. I mean, not being in the room, not being able to sense the energy in the room is disturbing for me. However, the way in which I facilitate and the way in which I was trained to facilitate is very much that I create a safe space. I set out a layered approach to how do we talk about and how do we investigate certain issues or problems. And then it's the groups themselves which should be working on it. So I'm very much hands off in terms of letting people have a space to be able to work. So the fact that I'm not receiving feedback as I talk isn't that important to me. And also, I never expect to be in the conversations of the groups. That's not my role. My role is to enable people to meet each other and then share knowledge with each other. So, the use of Zoom rooms and all of these other things is fine by me. I don't want to be in the Zoom room with the participants. I want them to have time together. That's the thing I view as most important in workshops. So there is a lot of difficulty, but I think, and that's where a lot of the sort of my consideration, and I did analyze the workshops I did last year to see where the stresses appear to be and where I could rebalance things. But in many ways it's how do you maximize the social encounter between people who want to be there, who want to be in the workshop, because that's the thing I always view as most valuable.
So your latest version of, or this year's version of workshops is Workshop on a Card. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a bit more about that and what makes this different?
Yeah, so what came out of a number of workshops, sort of Dissent and Hope and a number of other workshops I ran last year, was how to actually create a pathway of learning which was respecting the fact that a lot of people are under stress and a lot of people have time which is being twisted in weird ways because, work at home and all the rest of it means that sort of the working day has become a slightly weird thing. So I wanted to make sure that we could present the information in a way that enabled a person to be able to use it in ways that was aligned with their life and aligned with their capacity to concentrate. So last year I was sending out booklets in PDF format to go with the workshops to help people sort of have something to read before they came. And, this comes to the wayfinding issue of, provide people information so they actually understand the journey they're about to take. This year, I felt it was better to actually physically create cards which have the content in sort of, 3 or 4 simple sort of headline terms on the front of the card. And then the card actually contains ways in which you can make notes, write down your experiences, talk about, think about things, so that it actually creates its own notebook. So that when you come through to the next stage, which is that there are podcasts to go with each of the workshops. So about sort of 18, 20-minute podcasts have been created, which then allow me to be able to present the information which is on the card in more detail and link it to books or research or, projects I've worked on. Okay. To be able to then allow you to sort of choose when to listen. So you can listen to the kitchen, you can listen to when you're walking. So again, not making people have to be at a certain time in a certain place. Okay. Letting people have the card, have the podcast, so they can learn when they feel they can, they feel it's best. And finally, the podcasts then have within it instructions for a couple of activities in terms of an action to take or an observation practice to take, which then feeds into the final part, which is 1-hour Zoom meetings, which is so that people can then spend time with each other talking about the whole of the experience, asking me any specific questions that they have, but mostly being with each other, talking about these experiences they've had during the workshop, around the content, around the themes, around the issues, and then thinking about taking specific actions into the future. So it's about how do we design for synchronous and asynchronous, and how do we design for a much more self-directed sense of learning, rather than the idea of you're here for a 3-hour workshop, we're in a room together, because that doesn't exist. So how do I change? And the cards, the podcasts, the Zoom is how I'm doing it. So it's all about trying to use different forms of design and different forms of sensory experience to engage people, and also, as I say, balance anticipation and anxiety.
That's a really insightful way of putting it together. That drive on basically preparing people as much as you can in order to make almost that end product be as valuable as possible, or as rich as possible. That's really, really quite cool. Are they, so these workshops? You've set specific topics for them?
Yeah, so it's I'm giving 5 different subjects. So 2 of them are on communication issues to do with active listening and to do with dissent, and 3 of them are on cognitive design to do with wayfinding, to do with emotional design, and to do with network thinking in terms of sort of current theories of the neuroscience of memory and learning.
Cool. So if I want to sign up to one or all of them, how do I go about doing that?
The easiest way is on the acuity.design website. And then it's the workshop, and sort of go through to the workshops, and then you'll find there's a workshop at a card page. You can either sign up for discounted, you can get 5 workshops for 125 quid, or you can go to individual workshops if you're just interested in specific sort of areas, and they're £30 each.
Cool. And they're happening fairly soon, aren't they? So when do they start? When does that thing kick off?
They start on the 14th, so I'm running the workshops sort of basically Tuesdays and Thursdays from a sort of the 14th. But also at 2 different times, so 9 a.m. in the morning and 8 p.m. in the evening, which again, from last year working on workshops, I found that 9 a.m. gives me the ability to talk to people who are having breakfast in the UK, have just started work in Europe, or are just getting home from work in Australia. And 8 p.m. gets you people who are after work in UK and Europe, and either sort of mid-afternoon or lunchtime in LA.
Wow, having to set out and really think about the timings you're doing to be able to reach that multinational audience, that's got to have been quite a challenge, but that seems to be now the way you explain it is an eminently sensible way to go. Alastair, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me about that. Especially at such short notice as well. I'll make sure all the details of how people can sign up to your courses and that type of thing are on the show description. But also, you're very active on sort of LinkedIn and the different social media as well. So most people can find you on there and follow you and listen and see what the sort of things that you're up to. On the sort of final note, one of the things that you did put up the other day, which I thought was interesting, was a picture of what looked like a railing on the front. On the top of a wall that seemed to have Braille embedded into it, which on the first bit of it just seemed to be, wow, so somebody's had the thought to put Braille into that sort of thing. But it wasn't until you raised the point that actually the person would then need access to that entire rail that actually it's any good. And there does seem to be a lot of design things that are put together just to almost tick a box of, aren't we cool looking after people, but don't seem to deliver the function that they're actually truly made to deliver. And I guess the employing the skills that you have early on in a project will hopefully negate the need for that sort of embarrassing outcome in many ways.
Yes, in all of design, you'll find that we are still very, very much biased towards what looks good. Yes. Vision is still being prioritized in design in ways which is not helpful.
Yes. No, it is something that I know I'm as guilty of as the next person. So hopefully, I will give myself a good kick, as much as try and hopefully this podcast will give other people a good kick, and we can spread your message far and wide. Alastair, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of day.
Thank you, Barry. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. Please do get in touch with your thoughts, questions, and comments. You can contact us at www.barrykirby.co.uk and on Twitter at @BAZ_K. See you next time. And remember, it's more than just common sense.
Thank you for listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. Please do get in touch with your thoughts, questions, and comments. You can contact us on social media such as Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook at 1202 Podcast. See you next time. And remember, it's more than just common sense.